Pearl Harbor, Fleet Radio Unit Pacific, a gray morning in mid-May. Pencil tips hissed across message pads as rows of intercepted kana became clean English lines. A single signal from the boat designated I-16, reporting a rice run toward Bougainville, moved from paper to pulse. Lieutenant Commander Robert Williamson set his mug down and lifted the secure handset. 3 destroyer escorts would be vectored: the United States ship England, the United States ship George, and the United States ship Raby. None of them knew that one decode would set off the most destructive anti-submarine hunt the Pacific had yet seen. By that spring, American commanders had learned that Japanese submarines were more than torpedo platforms. They were arteries. Close them, and garrisons withered. The Imperial Navy's 7th Submarine Squadron stretched a picket line from Truk to the Admiralties, a cordon meant to warn of any American push toward the Palaus or the Marianas. On that line were 7 boats: I-16, RO-104, RO-105, RO-106, RO-108, RO-116, and RO-117. Admiral Shigeru Toyoda's undersea sentries waited to spot a battle fleet before it could close. The England's Buckley-class hull drove through a cobalt sea at a steady 20-plus knots, displacing roughly 1,400 tons. On the bridge, Lieutenant Commander Walton Pendleton read the plot and the sea-like paired texts. 186 men manned rails, phones, and weapons. K-guns flinging heavy depth charges. Stern racks stacked with more. And forward of the bridge, the device that would define the ship's legend: a 24-barrel Hedgehog mortar. British ingenuity had built it. American doctrine would make it feared. Unlike depth charges that boomed blindly at preset depths, these projectiles detonated only when they struck steel. Each little bomb carried a core of Torpex, and the launcher's tight pattern turned mathematics into menace. Traditional charges killed once in many dozens of runs. The Hedgehog scored roughly 1 in 5. The England's executive officer, John Williamson, Cambridge-trained, with a cool hand for geometry, could feel those numbers in his bones. Sub-hunting was angles and timing, sound traveling fast in salt water, bearings changing by fractions, lives turning on seconds. On Mortars 16, Lieutenant Commander Toyohisa Yoshitaka scanned the supply manifest: rubber feed sacks stuffed with rice. Supply missions were a gambler's throw. Surface ships drew aircraft. Submarines drew escorts. The boat could sprint on diesel or creep on batteries, but batteries meant air, and air meant surfacing. That necessity was a noose every submarine wore. Approaching the intercept, the 3 escorts widened into a line-abreast search. The George guarded the left, the Raby the right, the England drove the center. Sweep radars combed the horizon, the shipboard sonar reached down. In headphones, trained operators sorted whales from thermoclines, fish from steel signatures. Sonarman first class. David Chun worked his set in 15-minute rotations, turning the transducer, pinging, listening, turning again. Shortly past midday, a hard echo came back. Range a couple of thousand yards, bearing fine to starboard. The bridge got the call. In the Japanese boat, hydrophones picked up the American pings. Yoshitaka ordered the dive. Air roared from vents, water flooded tanks, and the bow bit down. Periscope depth came fast, then deeper still. Williamson penciled figures on the chart. Estimated target speed: moderate. Course: roughly southwest. Likely depth band: 1 to 200 feet, with a chance of sliding under a faint thermal. The Hedgehog's effective range and sink rate guided his window. The first salvo, a full spread, walked into the water and drifted through silence. No detonations. Clean miss. Adjust. The second pattern, set deeper, scored a single thud. Felt as much as heard through the deck plates. Damage, not doom. Machinery noises wavered through the headphones, the sound of men fighting problems in the dark. The third run reached into the wrong layer. A fathometer check later showed the target deeper than predicted. The fourth fell behind as the boat jerked into a sudden turn. Skilled hands below were counting pings, reading rhythm, and cutting across the grain of the attack. Williamson narrowed to one more set of sums. Bearing steadying, range closing, depth around 250 feet. He committed. The mortar coughed 24 steel pairs into the air. They struck, sank, and several found metal. The blast lifted the England's stern, knocking sailors to knees as shockwaves hurled through hull and water alike. In I-16's forward compartment, green water punched through plates. Emergency lights flickered. The nose fell into a black shaft that ended 3 miles down. Within minutes, wreckage and oil stippled the surface. 90-plus men vanished with their boat, but the codebreakers had already teased out more. Another intercept laid out the 7th Squadron's patrol line, a lattice of positions used before to keep watch on American carriers. RO-104, RO-105, RO-106, RO-108, RO-109, RO-112, and RO-116 were set like beads across a sea lane. The concept was sound. Force a fleet either to endure attacks or to divert. It assumed the line could not be found and cut in one sweep. Commander Hamilton Haines of Escort Division 39 was told to sweep west to east. 3 little escorts against 7 boats sounded like long odds. The calculus did not yet account for Hedgehog accuracy and persistent sonar contact. Before dawn, 2 days later, the George picked up RO-106 on radar, a surface contact charging batteries. The searchlight carved the night, guns trained, and the submarine dove. It was enough. Position and course were pinned. The George attacked and missed as the target juked at depth. England slid in to take the handoff. Williamson's first try failed. The second found home. The plume that followed was huge, a visible testament to a pressure hull unzipping. The ocean closed, swallowing 50-plus souls and a boat's memory. 2 boats in 4 days. Japanese listeners understood a new danger was at work, even if they did not yet know its name. Messages urged radio silence and minimal surfacing, but radar found steel on the sea. Sonar found steel below it, and the Hedgehog stripped luck from the evader. Depth charges had a weakness. To drop them, a ship had to pass over the target and lose contact, then grope to reacquire through churned water. The Hedgehog projected forward. If it missed, the water remained quiet. The next salvo followed seconds later, informed by fresh bearings. RO-104 was the next to cross paths. The Raby's radar saw her while she still ran on the surface, north-northwest of New Ireland. She dove. The Raby pressed 4 attacks. All missed as a deft captain wrung every trick from his training. Jamming bursts to clutter American ears. Sharp turns and step-ladder depth changes. Clouds of compressed air to mimic a damaged boat. The George took her turn and also missed, the target slipping through layers and drift. After 2 hours of cat and mouse, Williamson took the calculus back. He reasoned that a submerged boat burning power so hard could not keep dancing forever. The next spread blanketed the most likely energy-conserving path. Several bombs kissed steel. A secondary roar followed, cylinders rupturing, batteries and compartments failing. Oil dotted the water. Timbers floated up. Below, another coffin settled. 3 boats in 5 days. What had been rare now felt like an algorithm. Early in the war, depth charges managed a kill in a tiny fraction of runs. By the later years, improved doctrine raised it to better numbers, but the Hedgehog's contact-only blast turned averages on their head. The statistics were not the whole story. The rumor of a weapon that exploded only when it touched you sank deeper into morale than any one detonation. RO-116 was next. The George caught her running fast near the eastern end of the line. She dove in a hurry. Williamson fed in what the last fights had taught him: how quickly a typical boat could turn or climb, how much speed it could afford without cavitation. The first Hedgehog burst tore her open. No grand secondary fireworks followed, just the harsh chorus a listening set can read when a boat's internal frames let go one by one. For long minutes, the air in sonar rooms went tight as operators heard the slow tearing of steel and the choked rush of water. Then silence, final and complete. 4 boats in 6 days. Senior commanders took notice. Admiral Chester Nimitz wanted lessons learned. Admiral Ernest King wanted more escorts carrying more mortars. But there were still contacts on the chart, and the England's division was running low on fuel and ammunition. Relief arrived in the form of an escort carrier with fast destroyers to screen it, a hunter-killer group designed to take over. Standard practice would have been for the weary trio to turn for port at once. Commander Haynes asked for one last sweep while they headed for replenishment. Intercepts hinted that RO-108 lurked nearby. Late on the night of the 26th, the England found her. The sonar trace was crisp and shallow. The target was moving at a good clip, too fast for a crew still committed to long submerged legs, suggesting a captain gambling on speed over stealth. Williamson made the call within minutes. The attack pattern hit true. A bright, eerie wash of light from ruptured battery spaces glowed below the surface as the wreck sank. 5 boats in 8 days. One remained a particularly hard case. RO-105 under Lieutenant Junichi Inoue, with a senior division captain embarked as a passenger. The boat had a history: near misses and narrow escapes, rescue work that showed seamanship and nerve. Intelligence noted that the submarine had dodged torpedoes the previous year and snapped at an American cruiser without luck. The crew's seasoning made them dangerous. Japanese 6th Fleet watchstanders had begun to read enough of American transmissions to sense the hunters' positions, and orders pressed the remaining boats toward withdrawal. Fuel and air put hard limits on options. To leave at once, RO-105 would have to run on the surface through air-watched water. The George saw her first on the night of the 29th. The submarine dove. What followed was an endurance test. Through the dark hours into dawn and beyond, the George made run after run. The Rabi, joining with nearly every weapon left between them, spent against a target that would not present a straightforward solution. The Japanese crew executed every evasive art: sudden turns on short intervals, depth changes in tight bands, strict silent running, precise speed management to hold propeller noise below the threshold that creates telltale bubbles, bursts of air to paint false pictures on American sets, emergency trim changes that knifed the boat's nose or lifted the stern just enough to throw off an aim. For most of that day, the England held back. Doctrine suggested keeping the most successful ship in reserve. After a day of frustration, Haynes cut her loose. Williamson had been shadowing the geometry from the edge, mapping how the enemy captain conserved power when the dance lengthened, how the depth band shifted as crew fatigue crept in. He gauged the boat at around 200 feet and trending southwest. The Hedgehog spoke once more. Several bombs hit. A vast breath of compressed air blew. Then the long, heavy sigh of a hull surrendering to pressure. Oil and debris rose into daylight. The passenger, one of the Imperial Navy's more experienced submarine leaders, went down with the crew. 6 submarines in 12 days. Word raced. Admiral King later promised that the Navy would always carry a ship named England, and in time a missile destroyer would bear the name. But beyond honor, doctrine changed. The 7th Squadron's destruction gouged a hole in Japanese plans. Operation A-Go, the scheme for a decisive fight, had counted on submarine eyes. Take away those eyes, and aircraft and surface scouts had to fill the gap, straining resources already thin. The tech and the tradecraft mattered as much as the courage. The United States had poured vast industry into undersea warfare. Hundreds of thousands of depth charges rolled from factories, K-guns and projectors stacked on decks. New radars swept farther. New sonars saw more. The game shifted from intuition to calculation. Williamson's method, using sound transit times, bearing drift, evasion speed, and the geometry of a turning circle, turned the attack into a series of solvable problems. Sailors still needed judgment and grit, but the equations made their grit count. Psychology cut deep as steel. Captured documents and radio readouts told of skippers asking to abandon stations, of crews who came to believe that some new American device knew how to find them and would not stop. Attrition reached unbearable levels. The Imperial Navy had started the war with a respectable undersea arm. By the time of the England's run, operational boats had dwindled, and replacement rates could not keep up. American hunter-killer teams could be in many places at once. Japanese construction yards could not add hulls fast enough to replace those that went down into the dark. The physics favored the escort. Radar could pick a low silhouette at long ranges in good hands. A submarine on the surface for air and charge was a bright flare to such eyes. Underwater, advances in transducers and amplifiers let operators track even through mild layers that once hid a boat. Early in the conflict, an attacking ship often lost the target in the final moments. Now it could hold a thread of contact forward of the bow, fire ahead, and correct instantly. The Hedgehog's contact fuse meant there was no masking bubble of blast unless you had actually hit something. You did not lose your target to your own weapon's thunder. The England's crews sat at a hinge in the war. In the weeks that followed, Japanese airmen flew into the great carrier battle that would be called the Marianas Turkey Shoot. They did so without the timely submarine reports that might have sharpened their picture of American moves. Carrier groups, freed from the fear of unseen torpedoes from a picket line, ranged with a bolder stride. The ramifications stretched forward. Navies studied the pattern and built successors. Ahead-throwing weapons that walked detonations across depth and bearing like type across a page. Sonars that painted clearer underwater images. Training pipelines that made sonar operators and attack officers into a new kind of professional, as comfortable with angular velocity as with a compass. None of that erases the human ledger. Somewhere near Bougainville, and across the long sweep between Truk and New Ireland, 7 wrecks settled on the seafloor. Each held a crew's full story, from raw recruit to engineer to captain, who could predict an enemy's rhythm by ear. On the American side, not one sailor aboard the England, the George, or the Raby died in that 12-day hunt. That disparity speaks to more than weapons. It speaks to preparation, to an industrial base that could deliver thousands of sets and hundreds of thousands of bombs, to schools that built coherent doctrine and drilled men until decisions under pressure became reflex. The England did not repeat that precise feat again. Wars do not often hand the same pattern twice, but the ship's name became shorthand for a way of fighting: find, fix, finish, and confirm. Signal intelligence cued search. Radar and sonar refined it. Mathematics and discipline closed it. And debris on the surface testified to the contact. The crew's own vocabulary captured it best. They moved from art to science, from hunch to proof. The Japanese command adapted as best it could, modifying plans to rely less on submarine reports. Yet with resources narrowing, each adaptation forced another compromise. Aircraft that might have been used to strike instead tied to reconnaissance. Destroyers pulled into picket work rather than held for an escort screen. Meanwhile, American hunter-killer groups multiplied. An escort carrier could pitch aircraft overhead, while destroyers below built triangles of sonar coverage, trading contacts and updating tracks. Their gunnery teams standing by, but their true fight fought in headphones and on grease pencils. In after-action classrooms, officers broke the England's 5 key engagements into phases and drew lessons. 1. Initiate contact by any means, but pass control to the ship best placed and most practiced with the weapon of decision. 2. Maintain contact continuity. When one ship's picture degrades, another steps in without a gap. 3. Treat each miss as data. A salvo that explodes into emptiness still tells you how the target maneuvers. 4. Pressure the battery and the air of a submerged boat. Time is a weapon. 5. Commit the killer blow only when the geometry is right. A single tight pattern placed on an enemy who has burned through his margin can end the fight quickly. Those lessons spread beyond the Pacific. They informed Atlantic convoy escorts and post-war anti-submarine forces across many navies. Ahead, throwing weapons proliferated. Training rewrote itself around continuous contact. Sensors matured from pings into more nuanced systems that could read passive noise signatures. But the skeleton of the England's method, a fusion of intelligence, persistence, and calculation, remained visible. On a personal plane, the story returns to ordinary men at steel consoles. A sonarman steadies his breathing so that a faint bearing drift does not vanish under the drum of his own pulse. A plotting officer flicks his eyes between stopwatch and chinograph marks and sees a pattern others miss. A coxswain holds a course for a handful of heartbeats longer than comfort, so the last correction lands the ship exactly where the math says it must be. In the submarine below, sailors fight flooding with pumps and plugs, count the intervals between pings to guess the next attack, and hope a well-timed turn will make the difference. Each side balances fear against training. In the end, history holds both. The boats that died did so with courage. The ship that killed them did so with discipline. Between the two ran a thread of codebreakers turning syllables into positions, of analysts feeding bearings, of factory workers riveting and soldering, of instructors drilling watchstanders who would never see the faces of the men listening for them below. The England's 12 days crystallized all of it: industry, science, and sheer human steadiness, fused into a pattern that the enemy could neither fully understand in time nor break under pressure. Long after the war, veterans would stand on museum decks and explain to grandchildren why that odd forward-facing array mattered. They would describe a weapon that refused to waste its thunder unless it had found steel, and they would talk, quietly, about the first time a contact went from blip to boil on the surface. They might not reach for numbers, but the numbers would sit beneath their voices, silent pillars holding up the tale. A dozen days, 6 boats, hundreds of lives, and a turning of the undersea war that reshaped the wider fight above. The wrecks remain, deep and cold. The sea keeps its counsel. But the operational truths stand in the logbooks and in what came after. A navy that changed its tools and thinking, an enemy forced to retreat from waters it once prowled, and a legend that still teaches. The England proved that mastery of a domain is not magic. It is method married to will. On that lattice of ocean where code met calculus, where a mortar's tight flower of bombs bloomed and fell, the balance tipped and never tipped back.